So my duty tonight is to cover leading up to Lexington and Concord, talking about April 19th, 1775. It's very in tune with this time of year. Obviously, we're in June now, so we've passed the 250th, but still a momentous occasion that leads up to what we're going to be celebrating in a few days, which is the founding of the United States Army, which happens in Philadelphia when George Washington gets command of the Continental Army. So things happen really fast. That's going to be my theme tonight. Um, the revolution doesn't just start out of nothing. There's a lot of events that lead up to it. And as soon as April 19th hits, so many things happen so quickly. It's amazing when you study this time period from April 19th to June 14th, all the things that happen and how quickly the colonists rally around each other, especially in Boston. And a lot of it's got to do with what happens on April 19th. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. And as I said, I'll do my best to cover this as quickly as I can. I could probably talk for 6 hours on this. I won't do that to you. But I'll just start off by talking about what Boston was like in 1775. You see a map there on your screen. Boston today, if you visit Boston, I know there's some people on this call who are from Massachusetts and Boston. It's much different than it was in 1775. There's a lot of infill in Boston today. So if you look at the map there, you'll see the original configuration of Boston of 1775. It's almost an island. It's not quite an island. It's connected by a little sliver of land called the Boston Neck there at the bottom of the map. But water dominates Boston. It relies 100% on that harbor for its economy, for its access to the outside world. Most of the jobs in Boston are related to some way, shape, or form to the shipping industry. And so that plays a huge role in how Boston will, evolve over time and with its economy. Boston is the third largest city in the colonies at this time, about 10 to 15,000 people, depending on which accounts you look at. Not as big as Philadelphia or New York, but still a major city in the colonies at that time. One thing I want to say about Boston and Massachusetts in general that kind of feeds into why so much of the American Revolution begins in Massachusetts. Unlike colonies like Virginia and South Carolina and a few others that were royal colonies, Massachusetts had a very, I would like to say, progressive and autonomous charter. They spent most of their time as colonists as something that they could, take care of themselves in the sense that they're all self-autonomous. They didn't really rely a lot on being told what to do by those in London. And so when things come to a head in 1773 and 74, you kind of understand why people in Massachusetts reacted the way they did, because they weren't used to Parliament or the Crown really being involved in their day-to-day affairs, which you might see in places like Virginia, where I am right now. So a couple events that lead up to that I consider the two big events that lead up to the American Revolution on April 19th. One is the Boston Massacre there in March of 1770, right there outside the what we call today the Old State House there in Boston. Several colonists are killed. This is due a lot because there are so many British troops in Boston at this time. After the Townshend Acts and the Stamp Act, a lot of regular troops will be sent into Boston to kind of quell some of the small uprisings that have been happening in town. And so when you have this presence of the army in the downtown city, you have people like the Sons of Liberty and others who are really trying to push the envelope on I'll say the word American, they would have said Massachusetts, but freedoms and liberties for their people, things are going to happen. It was a tinderbox. And so here in March of 1770, one of the tragic things happened where several colonists were killed there outside the State House. It's called the Boston Massacre, though we won't dive into the Boston Massacre tonight. But as you research the Boston Massacre and learn more about it, you can understand that it was just a horrible situation on both sides. I don't think we would call it a massacre today, but you got to keep in mind men like Paul Revere, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Dr. Joseph Warren were excellent at shaping the narrative that was being given out outside of Boston. And so this becomes a rallying call for some of those people in Boston and Massachusetts to resist British authority. The biggest event that I think that really creates the situation that leads up to April 19th is the Boston Tea Party. And you'll see the 19th century sketch there, the Boston Tea Party in the bottom right. So this was in reaction to the Tea Act. And we can again spend all night talking about all the different parliamentary acts that was passed by Parliament to reclaim taxes and money for certain things that the Crown needed. But the Boston Tea Party was when really the colonists there in Boston started destroying private property and basically thumbing their nose at the Parliament and parliamentary laws. So there are three ships there in the Boston Harbor. Um, we really don't know who. We have some guesses, but we don't really know who was involved directly in the Boston Tea Party. It's a great cover up. Many people came out afterwards and said they were there, but it was such a covert operation that many of the people that were involved there on Griffin's Wharf, throwing the tea into the harbor, their names have been lost to history. Now you can bet men like Samuel Adams and Dr. Warren and others had a hand in it, but they were well too smart to actually be down at the wharf. And so in December of 1773, when these three ships pulled in with the tea, that the colonists are being forced to purchase for lots of reasons. The East India Tea Company was going bankrupt and they needed the money. And so a monopoly was put that the colonists had to buy this East India tea. And so this was something that, again, this is what the people living in Massachusetts did not like, being told what to do or paying a tax that they had no right, no part in voting for or having a voice in. And so it came to a head, as I said, there at Griffin's Wharf by throwing the tea into the harbor. And why that's such a big deal, not just throwing the tea in the harbor, but it's how Parliament would react to the Boston Tea Party. Parliament's going to pass several acts that we would call the intolerable acts today. It's literally four separate acts, but the one that really is going to bring home some of the pain to Boston is they will cancel the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter, that autonomous document that allowed them to kind of have self-rule. And they were going to be put in charge of a royal governor who would be Thomas Gage, who's also the military officer in command of all the colonies. And so now they've lost their governor, they've lost their assembly that they voted it for, and now they're under a military rule. Secondly, the Intolerable Acts will close the harbor of Boston. And as I said a little while ago, they really relied on that harbor. And so by closing the harbor, you're going to have many hundreds of people out of work. The economy is going to be really impacted heavily on this. And passing these parliamentary acts, these intolerable or coercive acts, it does another thing too. It also rallies other colonies to Massachusetts' cause. George Washington, when he reads about the Boston Tea Party, isn't really moved by what happened. He's more concerned with why private property was being destroyed. He even would write that they think that they should pay back for the destruction of the tea. But when Parliament passes these acts, Washington and others in other colonies start to think if they can do that in Massachusetts, they can do that here in Virginia or North Carolina or Pennsylvania or New York, etc. So when Parliament passes these laws is when you see really other colonies start to rally around Boston. Many colonies like Virginia will pass resolutions of prayer, days of fasting and commemorate, to support Boston. And so you start seeing even more inner working of these different colonies coming together, really to kind of support Boston in their fight against the parliamentary overreach. So let's talk about some of the three men that I consider the ringleaders of the revolutionary movement in Boston. There are many others, but I'm going to focus on these three. John Hancock, there on the left side of the screen, one of the richest men of all the colonies, was from a very rich family, was heavily invested in the shipping, He was also a smuggler. John Hancock made a lot of money off of smuggling things in and out of Boston. And when they start to clamp down on Boston, especially with the Tea Act, they start clamping down the smuggling, which really impacts John Hancock. And so you really see Hancock swing toward the revolutionaries, as I'll call them, or the patriots, when his smuggling business gets impacted. Now, I'm not trying to besmirch John Hancock. He does some amazing things and will be very effective as a leader of the revolution. But he's really getting impacted by the fact that the British are clamping down on the business there in the harbor. The man on the far right is Samuel Adams. A lot of you all will know him as Sam Adams because of the modern day beer, but Samuel Adams was basically the voice of the revolution at this time. He had the passion, he had the energy. He was out all the time, giving speeches, encouraging others, being kind of the voice of the patriots in Boston. The man in the center is much overlooked today, but he's the leader. I fully believe that. This is Dr. Joseph Warren, physician there in Boston, well respected by the British before the American Revolution, and respected by the Loyalists, the Whigs or the Patriots in Boston. Well liked, super well organized. He was a natural leader. Dr. Warren will play a heavy role in the intelligence operation that these three men will be running in Boston and Massachusetts. Warren, many people think if Warren hadn't died at Bunker Hill, he might have been given command of that American army outside of Boston, not George Washington, one of those what ifs. But my good friend Christian Despigna, who wrote a great book about Warren, would call Warren the Washington before Washington. And so he's kind of lost in history. But you can tell by the names of towns and counties as far away as Virginia and South Carolina are named for Warren upon his death. And so you can see that all the American colonists up and down the eastern seaboard really had high regard and high respect for Dr. Joseph Warren. So Gage is given command, well, not given command, he's already been commander of the American colonies at this time in 1774, but now he's been given the royal governorship of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it is an impossible job. When you look at what Gage faced when he arrives in Boston, he walks into a tinderbox. He will write pretty early on when he arrives in Boston and becomes governor. He'll write to Lord Dartmouth back in London saying that the situation is much worse than you ever knew, and no people are more prepared or geared for civil war than the people here. He's blown away by how quickly things have degraded in Boston. I think Gage personally probably blames both sides. He thinks that the Sons of Liberty are rabble rousers, but he also thinks Parliament and their response with the Intolerable Acts probably really made the situation worse, and they really did. So several things will lead up to April 19th. I want to point out quickly that just kind of show how quickly Gage's situation there in Boston will be degrading. The first one is what's called the powder alarm. This is September 1st, 1774. You can go to Somerville, Massachusetts today. You'll see there on the left of your screen the Powder magazine. That was there in September of 1774. This held the colonial powder. There's lots of arguments in many towns and counties across the entire 13 colonies about who owns the gunpowder in local towns and counties and cities. The British believe it was the king's powder. The locals believe it was the locals' powder. Gage is really concerned because he has his own spy network and he's listening to these people tell him that these local militias, which are starting to form up, are gearing up with powder. They're taking powder out of the magazines around Massachusetts. They're storing weapons, and so Gage feels like his only recourse is to go out and look for this gunpowder. And so one of the places he's going to go is send some men out on September 1st, 1774, to take what he would consider the king's powder out of this magazine. They go in there, they take not all of it, most of the powder out. They march back into Boston, but quickly, the system of riders, the Massachusetts colonial governments in these counties and towns had created a system of horseback riders sharing information from one town to the next. And quickly, when the word got out that the powder was taken out by Gage and the British regulars, the word spreads. And as this word spreads, the story spreads. There's talk that the British have burned Cambridge and they've shot women and children and et cetera, et cetera. There's been a firefight. None of this is true. But what it leads to is within several hours, several hundred, then thousands of Massachusetts militia will show up in Cambridge, Massachusetts in response to Gage taking the powder out of the powder magazine. This is what's called the powder alarm today. And what that shows to Gage at this point understands that the Whigs, or we would call them patriots today, Warren, Hancock, Adams, and others who are really fighting the British on, due to the coercive acts. He understands now that these groups are very well organized. They can get the word out quickly. They're armed and they respond quickly, and it's a very dangerous situation. So Gage, again, as I said, no-win situation. He's got it. He feels like he has to get the powder. He has to get as many of weapons of war out of the hands of the citizens because he's worried about what they're going to do with them. But then again, when he goes out and does this, it just stirs up the pot even more. Another thing that takes place, which is really forgotten, and it's really can be considered the first shots of the American Revolution, is Fort William and Mary up there in New Hampshire. And so there's a sketch there of Fort William and Mary in the center of your screen. So what happens here is there's a fort there. It's only manned by 6 people. So very much an undermanned British fort there on the coast of New Hampshire. The local militia groups, the local committees of safety, which are formed at this time as local leadership. There's a vacuum because a lot of these colonial legislatures have been shut down. So there's committees of safety are formed that kind of run local government. They realize that they want to go in and get this powder, the powder stored there in the fort. So over 2 days, they'll actually go in and invade or take over the fort. The first night, there's not a lot of violence back and forth, but on the second night, there are some shots fired. No one's wounded. No one's seriously wounded. No one's killed. But the first shots of the American Revolution, if you go up to New Hampshire, they will tell you they took place there in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they have a good claim to that. So it's really amazing to think that this incident happens in December of 1774. And what's even more amazing is Paul Revere was one of the riders that rode from Boston to New Hampshire to inform the militia there outside the fort that Gage might reinforce this fort. So they wanted to get that powder before Gage could reinforce it or take the powder out of the fort. So Paul Revere is very active as a writer, sharing information way before the 2 lanterns that he has hung there in North Church in Boston. And the final thing I want to mention on the right there, that is a modern day photograph of the North River in Salem, Massachusetts. That's a monument to the events that take place on February 26, 1775. Gage again gets word that there are some ship cannon in Salem. They're being retrofitted for carriages, and they're at a blacksmith shop just on the other side of the river here in Salem. He's going to order some British regulars up there on February 26th. They're going to get to this location. There was a drawbridge at that time. The Americans there, the militia there, learn about the regulars coming to Salem, and so they put the bridge up, and the regulars arrive. They demand the bridge to be lowered. The Massachusetts militiamen there refuse to lower it. There are armed militia there. The regulars are armed. There are citizens circling around the British column as they wait for the bridge to be dropped. It's very tense. One British soldier threatens to shoot someone, a woman. She yells back, if you're brave enough to do it, go ahead, but I doubt you are. Very tense situation. It goes on for a good bit of the morning. And so what happens here is a local minister negotiates kind of a compromise. He understands that the British orders are to cross the bridge, look at the blacksmith shop, and return to Boston. And so as this standoff has been going on, you can imagine that back at the blacksmith shop, whatever was located there is being moved out. So this delay has allowed the militia and the Committee of Safety in Salem to remove whatever cannon or firearms were there at the blacksmith shop. And so as time goes by, compromise is reached. They lower the bridge. The regulars march across the bridge. They get marched to the blacksmith shop and they march back and they leave. So no shots are fired. But again, another case of when the regulars go out, they are met and they are seen, they see armed militia surrounding them or in front of them. So just put yourself in the shoes of one of these British soldiers. We always say it's the best army in the world. And it truly was, but the people that the regulars that are serving in Boston, most of them were not experienced soldiers. Most of them have never seen combat. They're very young. They don't want to be in Boston. They're in a hostile town that does not want them there. And every time they get sent out on a mission, they are confronted with armed people. So you can see this buildup. You can see this tinderbox start to be created here. That's going to lead to obviously open warfare on April 19th. So let's talk about April 19th. Well, actually, we'll talk about April 18th first. So again, Gage has a spy network. It's not as good as the Sons of Liberty or Joseph Warren's spy network, but he does have spies. And so he finds out that they're in Concord, Massachusetts. They are storing weapons of war, not just firearms, powder, musket balls, but also tents and other items that you need to arm an army. And Gage is very worried about this. Concord's important in this story because at this time, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was meeting in Concord. Now, what this group was kind of the illegal de facto government of the colony. They had no authorization through the king, no authorization through the parliament. They had no authorization through Thomas Gage, the actual governor. But this is the legislature that the counties and towns around Boston created to kind of self-rule themselves. And this provincial Congress will be really in charge of funding the militia, arming the militia, training and setting up a system of government while the British are held there in Boston. So it's a really it's treason. And really it is, and that's how Gage saw it. So Concord's really kind of an epicenter of all these things. And it's also the location where Gage finds out that there is gunpowder. And most importantly, he finds that there are two cannon located in Concord. And this is kind of a big deal. My good friend J.L. Bell has done a lot of writing about this. But previous to this, two cannon in Boston were stolen right under the British nose by the Americans. And so interesting enough, Gage has not written his bosses in London that he lost two cannon. That wouldn't have gone over very well, obviously. So many believe that this mission on April 18th and 19th is to not just look for powder, musket balls, and other items for an army, but also to try to find these two cannon that Gage lost. It's also important to mention that all these county militias had muskets, they had powder, they had musket balls. It's not abnormal for these county militias to be armed. What's abnormal is for them to have cannon. 18th century cannon are considered offensive weapons of war. They're not considered something that you would have for town defense. And so the fact that these counties and these towns were collecting cannon really tipped Gage off that he had a bigger problem than just some people that were mad with the government, is that they weren't just looking to defend, they might be looking to attack. And so Gage sets out this plan that would step off on April 18th. His men would be led by the man there on the right, Francis Smith, a hardened lieutenant colonel that had lots of experience. And the plan would be to take light infantry and grenadiers, about 800 men, put them under Smith from the various regiments in Boston. So a lot of these companies of light infantry and grenadiers never operated together. And so that creates issues as the day goes on because a lot of these men are serving under commanders they've never served under before. But Gage wants to get these 800 men out to Concord super quick by sunrise, look for the items and get back. It's super, he's only telling a select few people. He knows that the Americans have spies there in Boston. He knows that there's people that work for the army that have been leaking things out. And so he does his best to try to keep this as quiet as possible. But unfortunately for Gage, it gets out pretty quickly. One of the overblown, exaggerated myths of April 19th is Gage's wife, Margaret Kimball Gage, who was an American, was sympathetic to the Massachusetts cause and leaked out the information to men like Dr. Joseph Warren. There's really not a lot of evidence pointing to that. I tend to think that there were multiple people working for the Army, within the Army, that got wind of what was happening. Also, this plan involved moving these 800 men across the Charles River via flatboat, and you need to get the boats together. So a lot of activity is happening in Boston that's not normal, and that word gets out. And so what happens is the word gets out that these men are going to step off from Boston Common, cross the Charles River on the evening of April 18th. Warren calls Paul Revere to his office. They chat. Also, don't forget about Dawes, who's another writer that comes out of Boston. Revere instructs the two lanterns to be hung there in Old North Church, signifying that the British are marching to Concord by sea. And what that means is they're going across the Charles River as opposed to marching across the Charles Neck. So it gives the militia and the different committees of safety throughout Massachusetts knowledge of which direction this column will be marching out. One thing, though, that is a little bit different than truth is the people in Massachusetts, the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, Dr. Warren, Joseph, all these men think that this mission isn't to secure arms. They believe the mission is to capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams, the two leaders of this movement in Massachusetts. Now, Gage does have permission. He is given orders to capture these two men. But Gage's orders, when he gives it to Smith and others, mention nothing of Hancock and Adams. Really, I do believe Gage's sole mission here, his sole objective is to get these firearms, get these cannon, get whatever he could out of Concord and back to Boston without capturing Hancock and Adams. But as Revere crosses the Charles River himself, rides up to Charlestown, and then heads out across the Mystic River and finds himself in Lexington. When he arrives in Lexington around midnight on April 19th, when he knocks on the door there, the parsonage, he tells them that Hancock and Adams are staying there in Lexington. That's why he rides there. His thought is that those two men are the objective of this British column. And so that is what the thought is up until, later on when they realize that, they're looking for the firearms. So the riders go out, and keep in mind, when Revere goes out to a town, he's going to identify other riders in that town, and they're going to spread out, and they're going to spread out. So it's a very complex network of riders that's going to go north and south and west of Boston, spreading the alarm. And so as this British column starts to march out of Cambridge, I should say, not Boston. They've crossed the Charles River, and they're heading to Concord. They can hear the riders. They can hear the bells ringing. They can hear warning shots being fired. They clearly understand that this secret mission they're on is no longer secret. And so they're really faced with a decision as they're marching out. Do they continue with their mission? They're already several hours behind. They didn't have enough boats to cross the Charles River in one wave. They had to cross it in two waves. So the column is several hours behind in their objective. And now they can hear these riders going out. Now they can hear these warning bells being sounded off. But Smith, who is a man that lives by his orders, is determined to follow his orders and head west to Concord. Now, as this column is marching out, as I said, they're falling behind, and Smith's going to make a decision to separate the column into two. He's going to get his light infantry in front and have them move quickly out. He's trying to make up for the lost time. He knows these riders are out. He's trying to get to Concord before they can move whatever is in Concord out of Concord. So the British column is kind of split. And so that's going to really play out, really impact how Lexington on what happens in the Green will play out the morning of April 19th. As the column is moving out, Gage gets word that this is no longer a secret mission. He's finding out that there are many riders riding through the countryside, that the militia units have been aroused, have been waken up, and they're forming up and they're mustering in. And so he's going to determine to send another 1,000 men under Lord Percy as a relief force out to help Smith. Now they're going to be several hours behind Smith. So Smith's 800 men are going to be marching to Concord pretty much on their own. Percy's men will play a major role in the fighting on the afternoon of April 19th, but in the morning, as Smith is marching out, him and his 800 men are on their own, and they have to go through a town called Lexington. That's just the way the Old Bay or the road between Cambridge and Concord runs through. Lexington, pretty prosperous town. It was a town that really had liberty sentiments. They were not many loyalists will be found in Lexington. As I said, John Hancock and Samuel Adams are staying in Lexington on the evening of April 18th as Revere and Dawes arrive. Adams and Hancock will circle up and they'll start discussing what to do. The Lexington militia will get called out. Captain John Parker, who's in command there, will have his force formed there in the Green, and they're going to await the British regulars that they find that they're hearing are on their way. Many people will ask, why are Parker's militiamen on the Green armed? What is their intent? And their intent, I mean, really is to defend private property, defend their families, defend their homes. Parker had no inclination to have an open fight with British regulars. He knew better. His intent was the same intent that the militia in Salem had, was to just be there as a show of force to let the British regulars and officers know that they were there and they were going to protect their homes. And so there really was no intent by Parker or Lexington militia there to have a fight there on the Green. But of course, events tend to, take out of control themselves there. So as Parker's militia are formed up there in the Green around 1 a.m., they're there for a little bit. Nothing happens. So Parker decides to tell his men to stand down, return to your homes, or stay nearby in case we need to call you back. Several of the men go to Buckman Tavern, which is still standing there today, a great museum to visit, and wait for something to happen. So several hours go by, and during this time, a lot of civilians, women and children, are going to be moved out of Lexington. They don't want them around. It's more for their safety. So during this lull between 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. is when you see, the women, children, the families start to move out of Lexington. But eventually the regulars do arrive. And the regulars arrive are the light infantry, as I mentioned. They separate that column into two. Just before sunset, just as the sun is coming up over the horizon. And so when Parker hears that the regulars are just outside of Lexington, calls the men back together. Several dozen men, almost up to 80, will muster there, will line up there on the Green with the intent to show force. Now, if you look at the map here, you see Parker's militia is in the middle of the map. The road that goes to the left that you see to Concord, that's the route of the regular column. The British column is heading to Concord along that way. So Parker is not blocking their route. He's just going to be on their flank. He's just, again, showing force, showing they're there to defend their homes. Now, as the regulars are coming up, they get word that there are armed men in front of them. So they're ordered to charge their weapons, fix bayonets. So as the light infantry are coming onto the Green here, the 4th and 10th Light Infantry you see there on the map, they're armed. Muskets are loaded. Parker's men have their muskets ready. So as the light infantry come onto the Green, they see Parker's men. they make the determination that they can't just leave this militia force off on their flank as they march on the Concord. So they go around the meeting house, which is no longer there, and they form up into a line of battle. The commander there is telling Parker's men to stand down, disarm themselves, leave the field. Parker's men kind of stand there. There's some confusion going on. There's a quote that's attributed to Parker afterwards that is something to the effect of, if they want war, let it begin here. We don't believe Parker said that. Parker's words and comments are well documented because a lot of the men that survived April 19th gave their own personal recollections days after April 19th. So we have a pretty good idea for what Parker's trying to do here. Parker eventually will tell his men to stand down. He sees the situation is getting very tense. He's got this, line of British infantry facing him. They have bayonets. They're yelling to stand down. Parker determines that he's shown his force, but he's not going to get into an open firefight and risk the lives of his men. They're going to start leaving the green slowly. At this point, at some point, somebody somewhere around the green, a shot goes off. And when that shot goes off, which I believe is someone probably around Buckman Tavern, there's lots of different historians in Lexington that will have their own theories. I don't think we'll ever know exactly who fired this shot. But when that shot goes off, that light infantry hears it and they react to it and they fire a broken volley, which goes into the men there of Parker's militia. And then chaos ensues. Some of Parker's men fire back, men flee. The regulars eventually will charge. A gentleman gets bayoneted, and so it becomes a pretty bloody affair. 8 men of Parker's militia are killed, 10 are wounded. So think of 18 casualties out of a force of 80. It's pretty big. Jonathan Harrington there, you'll see, will die right there in the green, right in front of his house. The legend says he died on the steps of his house and his wife was there at the door. We don't know if that's really true. He did die there on the green, probably within eyesight of his own home. So a very sad affair. Um, as Smith and Pitcairn arrive, they try to take control of the field. They get their men kind of under control. They give out a huzzah. They put them back in the column and they march on the Concord. Again, Smith is faced. Do I continue on this mission, or now that blood's been shed, should I return back to Boston? He determines to move on the Concord. And now, we're past sunrise now. So, this secret mission is way not secret and way behind schedule. And this is Amos Doolittle's famous sketch of the fighting of Lexington. Doolittle arrives in Cambridge about a week after the fighting of April 19th. He's in the militia of Connecticut. He's given permission to ride out to visit some of the sites that took place April 19th. He'll talk to a lot of the people that were there, and he'll draw 4 sketches of the events of April 19th. And so this is his rendition of the fighting there on Lexington Green. You'll see the regulars lined up and the Americans, the militia there, some of them leaving, some of them shot, some of them running, some of them firing back. So showing a very chaotic kind of situation there on the green. Real quick, I just want to talk about militia versus Minutemen. This is a big topic. If you go to Lexington today, you'll see this monument, which pretty much marks the location of Parker's men there on the green. They're called Minutemen on this monument. The national park there is called Minutemen National Park. But I would like to say most of the men that arrive and fight on the American side of April 19th are not Minutemen, they're militia, including Parker's men on the green. Lexington did not have a Minutemen company. This was actually called the Lexington Training Band. It's a militia unit. It's not Minutemen. Minutemen were created that the fall before in 1774 to be a more highly trained, more professional, equipped force that could respond at a minute's notice, be really quick in case something were to happen. The militia, every county, every town and most of the colonies had a militia unit that the men were required to be members of. And so most of the men that would respond April 19th are militia. They were Minutemen at Concord, which we'll talk about in a second. But the men that show up there on Lexington Green, even though the monument says differently, they were actually militiamen. It may seem like a small detail, but if you study this topic and you really nerd out on this stuff, you need to understand that Minutemen are different than militia. It doesn't belittle what the militia do, but it's just more trying to decide, figure out which towns, which units were Minutemen companies, more trained, better armed usually, and then which companies were militia. So moving forward, finally getting to Concord here, get to the fighting at Northbridge. This is a very busy map of Concord. I'm sorry, it probably doesn't show up really great on the PowerPoint. But again, the mission for Smith all along is to get to Concord, get to a place, especially get to a place called the Barrett Farm, which is up in the left corner of the map here. That's Colonel Barrett's farm, and Gage has pretty accurate intel that the two cannon he's looking for are ahead at Mr. Barrett's farm. So that's the objective of the British. Also, they believe the town center, that they'll find musket balls and other items of war. By the time the regulars arrive here, mid-morning of April 19th, most of the items in Concord, actually all the items at Barrett Farm are long gone. Revere is actually, Paul Revere is actually captured on April 19th. He will be released, but he'll, spread the word to Prescott. Prescott will arrive in the Concord. Other riders will arrive in Concord and start spreading the word that the regulars are out. And because of that, the people in Concord were able to get most of those items of war out of town. Really, the regulars find tents. They find, accoutrements of war for the military. They find musket balls. They throw several hundred musket balls in a mill pond, which several days later, people in Concord come back and get out of the mill pond. So they do destroy some items there in Concord, but nothing to what they were sent out to do. Um, so one of the important geographic features of Concord and what happens is a place called the North Bridge, which is just a little bit above the center of your map there. That bridge is very important because uh, Smith has sent several companies forward across the bridge to Mr. Barrett's farm to look for those cannon. And so as they go across the bridge, they can see up to the right on the hill there, on Major Buttrick's property, that militia are starting to form. Concord militia are there. Acton Minutemen will show up. Several other towns and communities are sending militia, and they're arriving on that hill. And so they have to leave a couple of companies at the bridge, the British do, to kind of guard the bridge to allow safe passage for that sortie that goes out to Barrett Farm. So as this is going on, the British regulars in Concord are starting to burn tents and other items. And smoke will start to come up over the horizon. And so the militia, who some are from Concord, are up on that hill. They assume that the British are burning the town. And someone will cry out, "Are you going to let them burn the town?" And at that point, Buttrick and Barrett, excuse me, who are in command up there on the hill, decide that they have to move into town to show force to hopefully keep the British from burning any more of the town. Let me drink of water real quick. Excuse me. So here's another Doolittle sketch of Concord. You can see the Wright Tavern there in the center. That would be a building used by the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly, also going to be used by the British officers while they're in Concord. You'll see to the left, that's the meeting house in Concord. It's still standing today. The Wright Tavern is still there today. And in the forefront, that's two British officers, Pitcairn and and Smith, and that's the Old Hill Burying Ground, which you can go up to that burying ground today. It's great to take this image up there and face it in the direction that Doolittle drew, so you can kind of get a vision of what Concord was like. The North Bridge is off to the right of this drawing. And here is the North Bridge today. So as the Americans are moving off that hill and they're under, really the Acton Minutemen under Isaac Davis are in the front, they're coming down in column. And their objective really is to get across the bridge and try to save the town from being burned. As they're coming down the hill, those two companies of light infantry at the bridge start to try to pull up the planks of the bridge to keep the Americans from going across. Unfortunately, they're having a hard time doing that. They finally get pulled back on the other side of the bridge, and they form into almost like a street style fighting formation. And at some point, as the Americans approach the bridge, much like Lexington, a shot goes off. Some believe it's a warning shot. Others don't know exactly the basis of the shot, but it definitely comes from the British side. And when the other regulars who are in that formation hear that, they fire a broken volley across the bridge, across the river there. It's going to kill two Americans instantly. Isaac Davis, who is the captain of the Acton Minutemen, will go down. Abner Hosmer, who's also from Acton, will go down, instantly killed there in the front. Uh, Barrett's going to run around and finally, he's going to yell out, "For God's fire, men! For God's sakes, fire!" And the Americans will level their muskets and fire a broken volley across the bridge. Several British are killed, a few are wounded. Two Americans are killed, four are wounded. And so, not a huge, bloody firefight, but this is called the shot heard round the world. And even though I will say the war starts in Lexington, the reason why this is called the shot heard around the world is this is where the Americans in formation will actually fire back at the British and have a stand-up firefight with the British. Um, the British will pull back away from the bridge, back into town. The Americans will march over the bridge. They'll be there for a little bit, but then they're going to pull back to that same hill. I'll go back really quick here. There we go. One more. They're going to pull back north on Buttrick's farm and kind of regroup. And during this time is when that sortie, that those four companies of light infantry that went to Barrett's farm, at this time, that's when they're going to come back and recross the North Bridge. They actually give them passage. A lot of people debate why that is. And I think a lot of it's got to do with just the shock and the horror of just what happened. And so those four companies march over the bridge. They see their comrades in arms, the several men who were killed. One man that had been wounded was hit in the head with an axe. So the word starts to spread that the Americans are scalping British soldiers. So you can imagine when that story hits, that's really going to spread a lot of anger in the British Army at that time. So, these men are going to march across the bridge back into Concord, and Smith is going to determine at this time that now he's fought a skirmish in Lexington, a skirmish in Concord. He can look up to his right to a place called Arrowhead Ridge, which is there on the map. It's a wooded ridge that you can see today if you go to Concord, and he can see militia forming on the Buttrick farm. He can see militia forming on Arrowhead Ridge. He understands at this point he needs to get back to Boston. And we're talking about 15 to 20 miles back. So he's got to get his column back to Boston in safety as quickly as he can. And unfortunately for the men with him, it's going to be a very long afternoon. This is a map from the National Park Service, kind of showing what we call today the Battle Road. Now, the Battle Road, as you may know it, is what's in the national park. The national park really preserves the area from Merriam's Corner, that's there on your map, all the way to Fisk Hill. So that portion of the road is part of the national park. The rest of the road is just a private highway. And so when you think of Battle Road, I want you to think about something that's much bigger than the modern day national park, because there's fighting all the way from Merriam's Corner, just south of Concord, all the way into Cambridge in Charlestown. And so I just want you to think as we go on through the story that as these regulars are marching back eastward toward Boston, they're under constant fire all the way from Concord and back into Charlestown. So one of the first areas that the militia and Minutemen are going to hit them on their way back is a place called Merriam's Corner. And you can visit that location today. The Merriam farmhouse is still there. You can see on the map, you can see in blue, that's the American militia and Minutemen arriving from the towns and communities around the area. And the red is obviously the British column marching back. And so really starting at Merriam's Corner, the Americans are going to use the landscape. They're going to use the woodlots. Now, most of this area is pretty open, but there are woodlots along the way. There's lots of rocky hills here and there along the road that have trees in them because they couldn't be farmed. And so keep in mind, most of these militiamen are from this area. They know the land well. The British do not know the land that well. And so the Americans are going to start using the landscape to their advantage. They're going to use the boulders and rocks. They're going to use the woodlots and the different hills and the different angles of the road as this road twists and turns its way back. And the British do have flankers out. So some of the movies like April Morning, you'll see with Tommy Lee Jones that the militia run up to the stone wall and fire right at the British column. That didn't happen. They had their flankers out. But even with the flankers out, these British soldiers are given almost an impossible task of constantly trying to push back the militia, keep the militia fire as far away from that main column as possible. In several locations like Miriam's Corner, Brooks Hill, Bloody Angle, you can see them marked here on the map. Fisk Hill. These are places where serious casualties took place on both sides. One of the places that is of importance to the American Battlefield Trust and the National Park Service is a place called Parker's Revenge. That's right there behind the Minuteman Visitor Center there at the park. Several years ago, through the American Battlefield Trust, through the Friends of Minutemen and other groups did archaeology there just north of the Visitor Center. The location that has always been marked as Parker's Revenge was somewhat in question by historians. And so using documentary evidence and using archaeology, they were able to actually shift the location of Parker's Revenge from where it was just slightly, but very importantly, just a few hundred yards to the northwest of where it was. And what's Parker's Revenge? Parker's Revenge is that same Lexington militia company that's there in Lexington. After they fight on the morning of April 19th, they're going to pull back. Parker's going to regroup his men, encourage them to go back out. They're going to march westward to the line of the town of Lincoln. So right there at the visitor center is where the town of Lincoln and Lexington meet. And they're going to set up on this little ridge, woodlot with some rocky area there. If you go there today, you can walk up right to where Parker's men were situated. And as the British column is coming eastward, they reach a small bridge over a small creek. And you can see that today too. It's not a bridge today, but it's a culvert. But if you look to the right and left, you can see the water. And as the flankers have to come in to get across that bridge, they have to take time to reform on the other side of the bridge. At that time, Parker's men up on the front left of the British column will volley fire down on the regulars. And so this is an instance where it's really shows Parker's endurance, where he's able to have this firefight in the morning, see so many of his friends and colleagues die that morning and be wounded, but then able to regroup his men and take them back into the fight. And the Lexington militia will continue along Battle Road. They don't just fight at Parker's Revenge and go home. They will continue to fight at Fisk Hill and other locations along Battle Road. But just goes to show that today, even today, using archaeology, we can change a little bit about how we understand and figure out where these things took place on the landscape. And just next to Parker's Revenge is a small lot that the American Battlefield Trust purchased several years ago, and it was one of the very first purchases that the American Battlefield Trust were involved in the American Revolution. So a little bit of organizational history there, but also very important on the research that was done. This is a very famous 19th century sketch here showing, it's actually Samuel Whittemore here, but you can see the militia are firing on the column there off to the right. You can see the wife to the left attending to a wounded comrade. Obviously, this is very much romanticized, but it's a very famous image done in the 19th century talking about these common men, these common soldiers, these common farmers and shopkeepers and such who were not soldiers, they were militiamen, but were able to answer that call the morning of April 19th. So as the British column is marching eastward, fighting these small little battles on the flanks of the main road there, they're going to come into Lexington, back to where they started that earlier morning, where they had that first fight. When they get to Lexington, they're going to meet Lord Percy's relief column. At the very beginning of my talk, I talked about these 1,000 men that were sent out by Gage to kind of provide support to Smith. You can imagine as Smith comes into Lexington, the relief he felt seeing this another 1,000 British regulars there. Also, Lord Percy had two cannon with him, and so Percy's going to set them up on a hill just next to Monroe Tavern, which is also there today, owned by Lexington Historical Society. So I highly recommend you see Monroe Tavern. But he's going to set his artillery up there near the tavern, and he's going to start firing shots toward the militia to try to scare the militia away. Unfortunately, for how this day plays out, one of those shots is going to go through the meeting house, the church there in town. So the word spreads. Not only are the British regulars shooting at us, but now they're also shooting at our churches. So you can imagine on the American side, the emotions, the anger that's building inside these people. And then remember, I told you about the rumors going around that the Americans are scalping wounded British soldiers. So you can see on both sides how this anger and emotion is building up. And so as Percy and now Smith combine forces and move from Lexington back toward Boston, the area is much more developed. The farms are smaller, there's more houses along the road. Some of the militiamen are using the houses for cover fire. Percy's going to do something very fateful. He's going to give permission to burn these buildings along the road so the militia cannot use them for cover. So now you have the Americans being fired at, destroying our churches, and now they're burning our homes. So again, just fuel for the fire for this anger that the Americans are feeling. The British are super tired. These regular soldiers in Smith's command have been fired on for several hours. They're tired. They've been up for 24 hours. They're very hungry. They're worn out. And it's being fired at constantly on the way back. So, the column isn't as tight as it should be. And as they move through the community of Menotomy, which is today modern day Arlington, Massachusetts, really most of the killing and most of the casualties will happen in Menotomy, not Lexington and Concord, but in Menotomy. It becomes very hand-to-hand combat, very personal. British soldiers in a place called Cooper Tavern are going to kill two men just sitting in there drinking some 18th century drink called Flip. The tavern keepers come back and find their brains bashed all over the wall, and there's just lots of violence happening. And one of those places that you can still see today is on your screen. This is the Jason Russell House, owned by the Arlington Historical Society today. It's one of the few buildings left along the road that has a tie to April 19th, but it's a very important tie. Jason Russell was an older man in his 60s, and he had a wife that lived here in the house with him. And as he finds out about what's happening, orders her away. He could easily have left with her. He's beyond the age of what many people would have considered the fighting age at the time. But he is quoted for saying, "A British man's home is his castle." And so he determined that he was going to fight here in his yard on April 19th. Unfortunately, for Jason Russell, he's going to die there on the steps of his home that day on April 19th. When his wife comes back after the fighting, she's going to find 11 militiamen and her husband laid out in the kitchen, which is those two windows to the left of the picture. 12 dead militiamen, one being her husband, are laid out there in the kitchen. And two accounts say that the blood was so deep it covered the heels of their shoes. So just a very bloody and violent fight. The Russell House has done lots of research. There are lots of, you can go in there and see the bullet holes from the fighting inside the house and outside the house. So I cannot recommend enough to see the Jason Russell House if you're interested in going up there and seeing how violent this fight is going on. Also, Monogamy, Dr. Joseph Warren, who I mentioned at the beginning, arrives and he'll almost get wounded when a musket ball grazes his wig, and so Warren is trying to be out in the front to rally the militia to keep at the British regulars, to keep at them, to keep at them. At this point, complete and order is breaking down on both sides. As Percy and Smith are trying to get back to Cambridge, they realize that American militia is blocking their route back to Cambridge where they came from. So they determine to march into Charlestown. And the main reason for that is because the British Navy is there in the harbor, and they're hoping that they can get back to Charlestown, close to the get back to the area where the Royal Navy is still in command, and go under the protection of the guns of the Royal Navy. There's also an instance where some American militia could actually block the route into Charlestown. But for many reasons we don't want to go into tonight because that'll take us hours and hours. That militia unit does not from Salem does not actually block the route, and so Percy and Smith's men are going to march back into Charlestown around 8 o'clock that night. So if you were one of those regular soldiers, you've been up probably the afternoon of the 18th, and now it's 8 o'clock on the 19th. So you can imagine how tired, worn out those men were. Total casualties for the April 19th, 73 British soldiers were killed, 174 are wounded, 26 are missing. On the American side, 49 are killed, 41 are wounded. So pretty bloody day considering the forces involved. Again, you have about 1,800 British soldiers involved that day. The American numbers are really hard to identify because, it's 80 men at Lexington, about 400 militiamen in Concord. But as that day goes on, hundreds more militia from Massachusetts and then Connecticut and New Hampshire and other New England colonies will arrive. So that number is going to grow. So several thousand Americans, historians believe, were part of the fighting here along Battle Road. This is a map showing the situation when George Washington takes command, so way in advance of our story, but it's a good map to show you. There in the center is Boston. Just north of Boston, you can see Charlestown. That's where Smith and Percy's men are going to march back into and take safe haven there under the British guns. So the very next day, April 20th, you have about 6,000 and growing Massachusetts, New England militiamen forming up in Cambridge, just off to the left of the map. A man named Artemus Ward, who will arrive that next day, will take command. He's the lead officer in the Massachusetts militia. He will take command of this new army. And one of the amazing things to study is how on April 20th, you have all these militia arriving to the Lexington alarm, to the call of what happened on April 19th. Artemus Ward has the hardest job. He has to keep these men, engaged. He has to keep them in camp. He has to organize them in regiments. He has to organize them. He has to feed them. He has to train them. He has to keep them in the field because at this point in time, the leaders in Massachusetts, Warren, Hancock, Adams, and others are determined to surround Boston and really, see how this plays out. Will the British leave? Will there be kind of a compromise on peace? It's a really confused time. And soon after the fighting Lexington and Concord, you have Fort Ticonderoga falling in New York in May. And so you can see how these events just start to quickly get out of control. And of course, on June 17th, there in Charlestown, a place called Breed's Hill, you have the bloodiest day of the American Revolution take place. And so just kind of see how quickly things evolve from April 19th to Bunker Hill. It's pretty amazing. Um, Really quick here as I wrap up, this is just a map showing how quick the news got out about Lexington and Concord. You can see I'm here in Virginia. I actually live near Fredericksburg. So April 30th, the word got to Fredericksburg that the fighting of Lexington happened. It reaches Williamsburg on April 28th. And as this story is spread out, you can bet that the message is being controlled by the committees of correspondence, by the colonial leaders who are against British rule. So you can imagine the story reaches down here in Virginia or in the Carolinas a few days later that the buildings were all burned, it was murder, and that's important to keep in mind of because on April 20th, John Hancock is going to send his account of the fighting of April 19th on one of his personal ships to London. So the first word that the British authorities in London hear about the fighting on April 19th is from John Hancock. And you can better believe that it was his account of the fighting, not Gage's account. Gage will write an official report and send it a little while later. But the very first word that London receives of the fighting on April 19th is the American version of the fighting. So finally, I just want to point out a really special place. If you go up to visit, obviously see Lexington Green. It's one of my favorite places. The North Bridge is fantastic, but I think you should always, in any visit to Lexington and Concord and Menominee in Arlington, Massachusetts, at the burying ground there. The obelisk to the left is to Jason Russell. He was buried in this cemetery. So were 10 other patriots or Massachusetts militiamen that died that day from the area. Later on, it was decided to move them all into a mass grave and erect this monument there. So you can go up there today and see where Russell and the men that died alongside him are buried. And just recently, you can see there on the right in 2024, a marker was put up just a few feet from Jason Russell's grave of a mass grave that legend always said that was where the British soldiers were buried. And recently they did some GPR up there, and there is a mass grave right in that location. So in 2024, the community up there with some nonprofit groups erected this stone here to honor the 40 British soldiers that gave their life there on April 19th. Very far away from home. The men on the left here were fighting for home. I guarantee you the men on the right wish they were home on April 19th. But it's a very fitting place to end any visit to Lexington and Concord and Menominee because it shows how we remember these men today and it really shows the important work that the American Battlefield Trust does still today.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.